Hello and welcome to this lecture. My name is Roger Charlton. I'm a GP or general practitioner in the UK, but in other countries I may be referred to as a primary care physician or a family physician. I'm also a professor of undergraduate medical education at Leicester Medical School in the UK and a training programme director for GPs in training in the West Midlands, UK. I'm going to start this talk outside where I'm currently working as a locum GP on the Isle of Jura in Scotland. The sound in the background is that of the sea and also the wind. First and foremost, I should say a big thank you to you for the opportunity and privilege to talk to you about Dr Elisabeth Kubler Ross. And I look forward to receiving your questions at the end and learning from you how things are and how care of the dying is managed in a different country, working in a different healthcare system. As well as being a general practitioner, I spend the majority of my time in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching and training, and so the continuum from student through to trainee through to qualified colleagues. My talk today is about Dr. Elisabeth Kubler Ross and the 5 stages of anticipatory grief that she defined in 1969 in her book Death and Dying. This is something that has stayed with me during my career, where I have a specific interest in what is now referred to as primary palliative care. And so palliative care as it happens in the community outside of hospitals and specialist units such as hospices. Dr. Elisabeth Kubler Ross was born in 1926 and died in 2004. She was born in Switzerland and trained in America as a psychiatrist and was a pioneer in the concept of palliative care, with her research, teaching and publications. At the age of 5, she contracted pneumonia and was hospitalised, during which she had her first experience with death as her roommate died peacefully. Her early experiences with death led her to believe that because death is a necessary stage of life, one must be prepared to face it with dignity and peace. She went on to attend the University of Zurich to study medicine and graduated in 1957. By July 1982, Kubler-Ross had taught 125,000 students in death and dying courses in colleges, seminaries, medical schools, hospitals, and social work institutions. In 2007, after her death, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and was named by Time as one of the 100 most important thinkers of the 20th century, and was the recipient of 19 honorary university degrees. In my early years, I completed a master's degree dissertation at Nottingham University in relation to medical ethics and palliative care, and at what point somebody could be defined as dying, and recognition of the fact that ongoing curative treatment was futile and so causing suffering. This was particularly with patients who had leukemia and where curative chemotherapy had failed. It is interesting that in relation to Kubler-Ross, she is also associated with something called the conspiracy of silence, where at that time particularly there was still a paternalistic attitude of doctors not telling patients that they had terminal conditions such as cancer. And even though everyone knew about it, and research shows that patients also knew what was going on, there was a conspiracy of silence because everybody was talking about it, except not to the patient. And there was the classical scenario where a relative would approach the doctor and say, "Please don't tell my loved one that they have cancer, as it will cause them a lot of distress." And so the conspiracy of silence was compounded if the doctor went along with this request. Times have changed and are changing, and we are very much more open in our communication with patients. In 1969, in her book on death and dying, Kubler Ross defined 5 stages of what is called anticipatory grief. And this is what she is best remembered for. And even today, no one has bettered this model. Both patients diagnosed with a life-threatening illness and the bereaved go through these 5 stages defined as anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It is important to say, as Kubler Ross did, that these 5 stages are not linear and do not therefore necessarily occur in this order, and that there is no predictable progression, so a patient may get stuck in one of the stages, and as Kubler Ross was noted to say, that she has regretted writing them in this way and in a way that is sometimes misunderstood. Similarly, not every patient goes through every stage. In this short lecture, I'm not going to go through each stage in turn, but rather talk about each in relation to my work as a practicing family physician. And so this talk relates to my experience rather than providing a purely scientific presentation. For me, the issue of denial, and so one of these important 5 stages, is perhaps the stage that I encounter most frequently as a family physician, and also includes a small number of patients who prefer not to know the truth at that point in time, and so have this information imposed upon them when it causes distress. The psychological stage of denial is best understood by continually returning to the patient and asking, "Is there anything more that you want to ask? Is there anything more I can tell you about your illness?" As they move through that stage of denial, eventually they will come and say, "Yes, I'm ready. Please give me more information." That needs to be recognised, and information not forced upon a patient when they may be going through the process of denial. This reminds me of a paper published in 1980 in the Annals of Internal Medicine by an author called Reiser. The title of the paper is important in relation to this discussion, and that is "Words as Scalpels." And sometimes when a patient is not ready, words can be like scalpels to them. The key thing that I have understood from this and written about in my early career was that communication with patients is absolutely key. And so it is important to first understand what a patient knows about their illness, and then asking what further information they would like about their illness, and giving that information compassionately and slowly. Much is written about breaking bad news, but the important point is the need for continuity and personal care, where breaking bad news is not a single consultation, but rather an ongoing dialogue of good, open communication, particularly as a patient becomes more unwell, where it is made clear that the door is always open for them to access you as their doctor. A working relationship needs to be developed for the future. And yes, patients go through other psychological stages defined by Kubler Ross, such as anger and bargaining. And equally, they should be recognised through good communication, taking these into account, and again, being kind and compassionate. In 1998, I had a letter published in The Lancet entitled, "Do we always need to tell patients the truth?" I wrote that for certain patients, it may be detrimental to tell them that they have a serious, life-threatening illness, which on occasions may be fatal. Nevertheless, much debate is generated by those for and against informing a patient. Even though it can be argued that truth-telling has become a virtual moral absolute, concern exists to ensure non-maleficence when disclosing information. I concluded, and again in relation to denial and Kubler Ross, perhaps not all patients wish to know the truth straight away, which may represent the natural reaction of denial. Good and continuing communication with the doctor may hopefully lead a patient to ask for further information. As the patient moves through the process of denial, they will want to ask for more information, and the doctor needs to wait for the opportunity to provide more information. As I said earlier, constantly asking, "Is there anything more you would like to ask me?" This also means scheduling in regular follow-up to allow for this process. One of the things that I've discovered over the years talking about this subject is that it gets more difficult as you get older, as you realise that your time is getting nearer, and that these may be the very questions that you may or may not wish to ask, hoping that a diagnosis will not be confirmed and that your tests are negative. And so denial, asking, surely that cannot be correct. And so whether or not you want to know or are ready to know. This will also form part of the bargaining process that Kubler Ross refers to. Again, the process is not linear, as bargaining may be intermingled with denial. The Kubler Ross model is not an exact scientific model, but rather one that helps us explain the reaction of patients when they encounter a life-threatening illness. So what of the stage of anger? In my experience, this comes at the beginning of the diagnosis. Anger and denial, again, are often as one rather than separate individual stages. Anger that one has a life-threatening illness, or sometimes anger aimed at healthcare professionals. Why was this not detected earlier? Or maybe anger by a relative. Anticipatory grief and the 5 stages do not only refer to the patient, but they can also take place in a close family member as they come to terms what is happening with a loved one. It can also be a process of grieving that a family member goes through after a patient dies. And if they get stuck in the stage of depression, then their grief can become pathological grief rather than normal grief. More later about the stage of depression. For me, the stage of acceptance is particularly difficult, and I wonder if there should be a sixth stage of anticipatory grief where people get stuck and often stay. And that is certainly my experience as a practitioner, for I so rarely see people who move and stay into a stage of acceptance. But first, let me give you an example of acceptance. I'm in the process of editing a book on doctors as patients, and I recalled a letter in the New Zealand Medical Journal which had a profound impact on me when I read it over 20 years ago. It was published in 2001. The letter is from a practicing doctor who has liver cancer, and it appears in the journal where his research also regularly appears. And this letter is written, which poignantly appears next to his obituary in the same page of the journal. Let me read it to you. Just to emphasize, immediately following this letter by Dr. Paul Egermeyer is the obituary of Dr. Paul Egermeyer, a GP and a researcher into pulmonary thromboembolism in New Zealand. His letter is entitled "A Message of Hope to Those in Painful Expectation of Death." When to the sometimes bleak prospect of death, which awaits us all, is added pain, anguish may result. Both nature and man have conspired or suffered to this end throughout history. The writer of this letter is experiencing liver pain, presumed due to bleeding of liver metastases, with primary liver cholangiocarcinoma. This may be one of the worst pains that affect the human frame. To you I send a message of hope, a testimonial to the wonder of morphine, and a personal tribute from someone who is usually very cynical to the most marvellous product of the 20th century medicine, palliative care. It really does work. And this is reproduced with permission of the New Zealand Medical Journal. This is indeed somebody who is in acceptance, as defined by Kubler Ross, of the end-stage cancer, and giving the important message of how vital good palliative care is. For me, palliative care constitutes two parts. First, good communication, which is a hallmark of care throughout the person's illness and with the family afterwards in the time of bereavement. And secondly, the science of symptom control and knowledge and competence in its application. I might boldly say that the latter is easier in comparison to the former, where all the challenges are. And these include the recognition of the 5 stages of anticipatory grief and the associated communication in relation to them. I stated that there was a 6th phase of anticipatory grief, as if I were to write a paper on the subject, it would be the one that I encounter regularly, and it is the stage where most patients get stuck and do not progress to acceptance. I've defined this phase as resignation. Resignation to the fate on something that the patient no longer denies, but that they do not readily accept, and understandably are still angry and would jump at the chance for cure and not to have to go down the palliative care trajectory. It is not a normal reaction to be accepting that you are dying. It will be interesting to hear your views on this and your experiences. It could be that one refers to resignation as the stage that I have not so far mentioned in the Kubler Ross model, that of depression, which comes before acceptance. But it is different from depression. Resignation is a normal, expected reaction, as usually no one wants to die or have a life-threatening illness and be resigned to one's fate. Don't get me wrong, yes, some patients may get depression which responds to antidepressants, but it does not take away the diagnosis, which in the Kubler Ross model has been denied and a process of bargaining gone through. Perhaps this is a question for discussion later. Do we overdiagnose depression in the dying, as we feel it must be one of the Kubler Ross psychological stages? A challenge then for us all: is there not a new sixth stage of resignation? Before questions, I will finish with some information about Dr. Elisabeth Kubler Ross. During the 1970s, Dr. Kubler Ross became the champion of the worldwide hospice movement. She travelled to over 20 countries on 6 continents, initiating various hospice and palliative care programs. In 1970, she spoke at the prestigious Ingersoll Lecture at Harvard University on the subject of death and dying. In 1972, she spoke to the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging to promote the Death with Dignity movement. In 1977, she was named Woman of the Year by Ladies' Home Journal. Kubler Ross was the first individual to transfigure the way that the world looks at the terminally ill. She pioneered hospice care, palliative care, bioethics, and was the first to bring terminally ill individuals' lives to the public eye. She was a driving force behind the movement for doctors and nurses alike to treat the dying with dignity. Her extensive work with the dying led to the internationally best-selling book on death and dying in 1969, from which she proposed the now 5 well-known stages of grief that we have discussed in this lecture. After 2000, an increasing number of companies began using the 5-stage model to explain reactions to change and loss. This is now known as the Kubler Ross change curve. In general, individuals experience most of these 5 stages when faced with their imminent death. The 5 stages of grief have since also been adopted by bereavement as applying to the survivors of a loved one's death as well. I often come to this seat on the Isle of Jura as it gives an opportunity for me to reflect. Thank you for listening to this pre-recorded lecture in preparation for the lecture on October the 18th, when there will be a chance to ask questions. I hope that you have found it useful, both my reflections and interpretations of the 5 stages of anticipatory grief as defined by Elisabeth Kubler Ross. It's a serious subject, and I hope that the chance to include nature within it and the wonderful sounds and sights will help us further reflect. I will finish with one slide of a view that I so frequently see when I take this walk, where it says a single track road, and that makes me think of palliative care, which is a one-way trajectory. And so the 5 stages of anticipatory grief as defined by Elisabeth Kubler Ross, to whom we extend our gratitude, and also for helping catalyse the hospice movement and the ethos and philosophy of palliative care.